Pregnant wife falls into coma during labor. The mistress laughs until the doctor reveals, "It's triplets," and everyone is shocked. "Now you're mine, Edward. All mine." Marina's voice, low and cutting, sliced through the sterile hospital corridor, but Edward barely heard her. His eyes were fixed on the closed door of the operating room, where his wife Sarah's life hung in the balance, with a medical team fighting for her. The air felt thick, heavy, and every second dragged on with torturous slowness. He felt an involuntary tremor in his hands, his shirt clinging to his back with cold sweat. How had it all come to this? How had the dream of a lifetime turned into this nightmare in a hospital hallway, with his mistress whispering poisonous promises while his wife battled to survive? If you want to know how this betrayal ends, like this video now and subscribe to the channel. Edward Thompson was a name that graced architecture magazines. Owner of a construction firm reshaping Chicago's skyline, he was the epitome of success. By his side, Sarah Miller Thompson, an art curator with an intelligence as sharp as her grace, completed the picture of a perfect couple. They had what seemed like a solid love, a partnership built over 7 years of complicity, laughter, and a silent pain only they knew. Their home in Oak Park, a modern structure of glass and lightstone, was magnificent, but it echoed with an emptiness no artwork could fill. It was the silence of absence, of sleepless nights marked by restrained tears and the painful ritual of fertility injections. Each failed attempt was a small death, a blow to the hope they stubbornly rebuilt. 7 years, 7 cycles of expectation and frustration. Until on the 8th in vitro fertilization attempt, the result they hardly dared hope for materialized in a blood test. Positive. Sarah, at 37, was pregnant. The news transformed her. A glow Edward hadn't seen in years returned to her eyes. She was radiant, touching her belly every 5 minutes as if needing to confirm the miracle was real. Finally, she would be a mother. Edward smiled for the ultrasound photos, hugged his wife, joined discussions about names and nursery colors. He seemed happy, but happiness was a thin mask, and behind it something dark lurked. He carried a secret with the power to burn everything to ashes. A mistress. Marina Vargas was the embodiment of ambition. At 29, newly arrived at Edward's firm, she was a talented architect with a beauty that disarmed and a coldness that made her ruthless in her goals. She saw Edward not as a married man, but as a stepping stone, the most important in her career. And he, exhausted from the pressure of maintaining a facade of strength for Sarah during the years of treatment, seduced by Marina's blatant attention and admiration, gave in. The affair started as a cliché. Coffee after hours, a conversation that lingered, a touch that lasted a second longer than professionally acceptable. Soon it turned into secret meetings in luxury hotels, flimsy excuses about late-night meetings. It became an addiction, an escape from the emotionally draining reality of his home. While Sarah, with the pure joy of a first-time mother, spent afternoons setting up the nursery, choosing every detail with meticulous love, Edward's phone buzzed with messages from Marina, promises of a new life, a future where he'd be free to live a real love. "Once that baby is born, you dump her and we start," she wrote, with a frightening certainty. Edward read the messages and felt a knot in his stomach. He was trapped between 2 worlds, the loyalty and history he'd built with Sarah and the overwhelming selfish passion he felt for Marina. He told himself it was temporary, that he'd end it after the dust settled, after the baby was born and Sarah was strong. It was a lie he repeated to himself to sleep at night. But lies have short legs and leave trails. Sarah, with her intuition sharpened by pregnancy and years of intimacy with her husband, began noticing the cracks in his facade. A feminine perfume that wasn't hers lingering on his jacket. The rush to shower as soon as he got home, as if needing to wash away more than the day's fatigue. The final straw was the credit card bill, an expensive dinner at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, on a Tuesday when he'd sworn he was at the office finishing a project. She didn't make a scene. She waited for him to arrive, sat across from him in the living room, and placed the bill on the coffee table. Her voice was calm, but laden with a weight that made the air thin. "Where were you, Edward?" His denial was instant, almost automatic. "Working, I told you." But he couldn't hold her gaze. The truth was there in Sarah's eyes, which knew him better than he knew himself. He crumbled. He cried, begged forgiveness, swore it was a stupid mistake, a moment of weakness, and that he'd end it immediately. Sarah listened in silence. Each of his words was a knife twisting in her chest. The image of the nursery, perfectly set up, flashed in her mind. The sensation of her child moving inside her. For him, and for the love she still felt, she made a decision. "I don't want to know who she is," she said, her voice firm, though inside she was shattered. "I want you to fix this. And I'll wait. I'll wait until our child is born. Then we decide what to do with what's left of us." She stood and went to the bedroom, leaving him alone in the living room with the crushing weight of his betrayal. Sarah's decision wasn't forgiveness. It was a deferred ultimatum, a fragile truce sustained only by the anticipation of the baby's arrival. Edward promised himself he'd earn this second chance. He'd pull away from Marina, dedicate himself to Sarah and the child, and rebuild the trust he'd broken. But the addiction was stronger, and the web of lies was woven too complexly to unravel with a simple promise. Edward's promise to end things with Marina evaporated in the morning air. He woke with a nauseous feeling, the weight of the confrontation with Sarah crushing his chest. Beside him, she slept, but it wasn't peaceful. Her face was tense, marked by the pain he'd caused. He rose quietly, dressed in the dark, and left before she woke, unable to face her eyes again. The first thing he did in the car was grab his phone. The temptation was an itch under his skin, a physical need. He needed to hear Marina's voice, needed her validation to feel less monstrous. "She found out," he said, his voice low as soon as she answered. On the other end, Marina's reaction wasn't surprise or fear, but a calculated calm. "And? That doesn't change anything, Ed. It just speeds things up. Now you have the perfect reason to leave. Say you need time to think, come over here." The simplicity of her proposed solution scared and seduced him in equal measure. To Marina, his marriage was a mere logistical obstacle, a contract to be terminated. There was no room for emotional complexity, for the 7 years of history, for the child on the way. Her vision was clean, direct, focused on the end goal, having him for herself. And Edward, exhausted from the guilt and tension in his own home, found a dangerous relief in that simplicity. He didn't go to her apartment, not yet, but the conversation rekindled the flame of the affair he'd sworn to extinguish. The following weeks were an exercise in duplicity. At home, he was the repentant husband, attentive. He accompanied Sarah to prenatal appointments, massaged her swollen feet at night, talked to the baby through her belly, feeling the kicks and marveling at the life he'd helped create. In those moments, guilt consumed him. He looked at Sarah, at the fragile trust she was trying to rebuild, and hated himself. He saw her unconditional love for the unborn child and tasted the bitter flavor of his own betrayal. But outside home, he was another man. Project meetings with Marina stretched for hours, charged with electric tension. Accidental touches under the conference table, glances exchanged over blueprints, emails with double meanings. The affair no longer needed hotels. It unfolded in the empty spaces of everyday life, in the interstices of his professional world. Marina was a master at keeping the flame alive. She praised him in front of colleagues, exalting his talent, making him feel powerful and desired. Then, in private, she deconstructed him with cruel precision. "She forgave you too easily," Marina commented one day, while reviewing a model of a new building. "Women like Sarah don't forgive. They manage the damage. She's keeping you on a leash because of the baby. Once it's born and she has what she wants, you'll see who she really is." Each of her words was a seed of doubt planted in Edward's mind. He began interpreting Sarah's calm not as strength, but as strategy. Her silence was no longer a sign of pain, but of calculation. Marina was rewriting the narrative, turning Sarah from victim to manipulator. And Edward, desperate for a justification for his own actions, started to believe. He needed to believe that Sarah wasn't the saint everyone imagined, that his marriage was already doomed before Marina appeared. It was the only way to live with what he was doing. Meanwhile, Sarah navigated her pregnancy with a silent solitude. She felt Edward's distance, even when he was by her side. His body was present, but his mind and heart were elsewhere. She saw how he guarded his phone, how his answers became vague. His promise to end it all sounded increasingly hollow. But she clung to her decision. The focus was the baby. She attended prenatal yoga classes, read books on motherhood, talked to her mother, Mrs. Nancy, about her fears and joys. Mrs. Nancy, an observant and pragmatic woman, sensed something was wrong. "That man's walking on eggshells, honey," she said one day, while helping Sarah fold the tiny baby clothes. "I don't like the way he looks at you, like he's apologizing for something he hasn't done yet." Sarah just shrugged, forcing a smile. "It's just work pressure, Mum, and anxiety about the baby coming." She didn't have the strength to confess the truth, to admit out loud that her dream marriage was crumbling. Admitting it would make it real, and she needed to maintain the illusion of normalcy, at least until she had her child in her arms. Marina's audacity, however, knew no bounds. She began leaving deliberate marks, small acts of psychological sabotage. One day, Edward came home with a visible scratch on his neck, which he tried to pass off as an accident with his shirt collar. On another occasion, Sarah found an earring that wasn't hers in the car's glove compartment while searching for a document. It was a modern, expensive design, the kind Marina would wear. Each discovery was a small electric shock, a cold confirmation that she wasn't imagining things. The truce she'd proposed was being violated systematically and cruelly. She didn't confront Edward about the earring. She just placed it on his nightstand, without a word. When he saw it, his face drained of color. He said nothing, and neither did she. The silence between them became an abyss, filled with everything unsaid. Marina's cruelty peaked at a company party. Sarah, now nearly 8 months pregnant, felt uncomfortable and tired, but made an effort to accompany Edward. It was important to keep up appearances. At the party, Marina was the center of attention, circulating in a red dress that seemed designed to provoke. She greeted Sarah with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How you look huge. Must be tough for Edward, huh? All that deprivation," she said in a tone of false sympathy, loud enough for those around to hear. Sarah felt the blood rush to her face. The humiliation was public, calculated. She looked at Edward, expecting him to defend her, to put Marina in her place. But he just averted his gaze, uncomfortable, muttering something about getting her a drink. In that moment, Sarah understood. He wouldn't protect her. He was paralyzed, a hostage to the situation he'd created. She didn't wait for the drink. She just turned and walked toward the exit, with all the dignity she could muster. Each step was heavy, not just from the baby, but from the overwhelming certainty that she was completely alone. The love she'd tried to save no longer existed. What remained was just a convenient arrangement, a facade about to crumble. The decision she'd deferred until after the birth now seemed inevitable. The question was no longer if their marriage would end, but how she'd survive the wreckage. And for the first time, a new feeling beyond pain and disappointment began to form inside her. A cold, silent resolve. She wouldn't be just a victim in this story. The humiliation at the company party was a turning point for Sarah. The pain didn't vanish, but crystallized into a cold determination. She stopped waiting for Edward to change or for the situation to resolve magically. From that day, she began preparing for a life without him, moving with a calm and purpose that disconcerted Edward. He, accustomed to the predictability of her pain, didn't know how to interpret this new strength. He saw his wife moving through the house, organizing the final details for the baby's arrival. But there was a distance in her gaze, as if she were already living in a future where he had no part. She spoke to him about practical matters, bills, hospital logistics, emergency contacts, with the efficiency of a project manager, devoid of the intimacy they'd once shared. This new dynamic left Edward in limbo. Guilt gnawed at him, but Marina's calculated coldness remained a safe haven for his wounded ego. He found himself increasingly entangled in her web, justifying his absences with the excuse that Sarah needed space. In truth, it was he who needed escape, and Marina offered it with poisoned generosity. The The day everything fell apart started ordinarily. Sarah woke feeling abnormal swelling in her hands and feet. Her rings, which she hadn't worn in weeks, seemed a memory from another life. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. Her face was puffy, her eyes smaller. She attributed it all to the end of pregnancy, Chicago's heat, accumulated fatigue. But when she stood, a sudden dizziness forced her to lean on the wall, and tiny spots of light danced in her vision, blurring the world. A throbbing headache began settling at the base of her skull, a constant dull drum. It was her mother, Mrs. Nancy, who realized the severity. She arrived for her daily visit and found her daughter on the couch, pale, breathing with difficulty. "Sarah, you're not okay," Nancy said, her voice laced with urgency that cut through her daughter's fog of malaise. She touched Sarah's forehead, then her ankles. "You're burning up and swollen like a balloon. We're going to the hospital, now." Sarah tried to protest, saying it was an overreaction, that her appointment was only next week, but her mother's firmness left no room for debate. In minutes they were in the car, heading to Northwestern Memorial Hospital. During the drive, Sarah's vision worsened, and the headache became unbearable pressure. Each bump in the road was a wave of nausea. At the hospital, the emergency team's efficient calm contrasted with Nancy's growing panic. Sarah's blood pressure was measured, 180 over 120, a number that made the nurse look at the doctor with silent urgency. The obstetrician, Dr. Elena Ramirez, a middle-aged woman with an air of having seen it all without flinching, reviewed the tests with impressive speed. Her face was serious, but her voice firm and reassuring as she addressed Sarah and Nancy. "Sarah, you have severe preeclampsia. Your pressure is at dangerous levels for you and the baby. We can't wait, we need to induce labor now." The phrase landed in the air-conditioned office with the weight of a sentence. Induce labor? Now? Sarah felt the air escape her. This wasn't how it should be. There was no time to prepare, to call Edward, to live the moment she'd dreamed of for nearly a decade. Panic rose in her throat, but Dr. Ramirez's gaze kept her anchored. "We'll take care of you and your child. You're in the best place possible." As Sarah was prepped for the procedure, Mrs. Nancy, with trembling hands, grabbed her phone to call Edward. He was in a sophisticated restaurant in Lincoln Park, the kind with low lighting and waiters who moved like shadows. Across from him, Marina laughed at something he said, twirling her glass of red wine. The candlelight danced in her eyes, and for a moment, Edward forgot the world outside that table. He was immersed in the illusion of a life without complications, a life where he was just a successful architect, dining with a beautiful woman. His phone vibrating in his pants pocket was a violent intrusion into that refuge. He saw mother-in-law on the screen and felt a chill. He answered, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Edward?" Nancy's voice was almost unrecognizable, torn by panic. "It's Sarah. She's bad. Her pressure's sky-high. They're taking her to surgery now. Come to Northwestern Memorial, for God's sake." Edward's world shattered. The restaurant sounds, Marina's laughter, the taste of wine in his mouth, all vanished. He went pale, blood draining from his face. The words surgery and pressure sky-high echoed in his mind. He stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. I have to go," he stammered, tossing some bills on the table without even looking at the check. Marina watched him, her surprise quickly turning to irritation. What happened? What did that witch of a mother-in-law want? "It's Sarah, the hospital," was all he could say before turning and running toward the exit, leaving her alone at the table. Fury consumed Marina, the perfect night, the climax of her seduction, interrupted by the sick wife. She didn't see it as a medical emergency, but as manipulation, Sarah's last desperate act to pull Edward back. In a surge of rage and possessiveness, she grabbed her purse and followed him. She wouldn't let him go alone. She wouldn't allow guilt and pity to make him return to Sarah's side. She needed to be there to control the narrative, to ensure this crisis was the definitive end of their marriage. She tailed him, determined to watch the end of that story up close, without imagining the ending would be very different from what she'd planned. The drive to the hospital was a blur for Edward. He drove with desperate urgency, weaving through Chicago traffic, hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Each red light was torture, each slow car ahead an unbearable obstacle. Nancy's panicked voice echoed in his head, mixed with the image of Sarah, fragile and pregnant, and Marina's irritated face at the restaurant. The weight of his choices crashed down on him with brutal force. He'd spent months living in a parallel reality, a world of convenient lies where consequences seemed distant. Now reality hit him like a runaway train. His wife's and child's lives were at risk, and he'd been dining with his mistress. The sordidness of his situation was undeniable, stripped of any justification he could have created for himself. When he finally reached Northwestern Memorial Hospital, he ran through the white antiseptic corridors, the sound of his shoes echoing his heart's frantic beat. He found the maternity ward and spotted Mrs. Nancy huddled in a chair in the waiting room, her face ravaged by worry. But before he could reach her, a figure stepped in his path. It was Marina. She stood in the middle of the hallway as if waiting for him. Dressed in an elegant black dress, makeup impeccable, hair perfectly aligned. Amid the controlled chaos of the hospital, the palpable anguish of families around, she seemed an anomaly, an actress who'd wandered onto the wrong stage. Her presence there was so out of place, so wrong, that for an instant, Edward couldn't process it. The scent of her perfume, the same one he tried to wash off before getting home, hit him like a punch. "You can't be here," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, incredulity mixing with anger. This was a sacred space of pain and hope, the place where his family was being torn apart or saved, and her presence was a profanation. Marina raised an eyebrow, a venomous smile slowly forming on her lips. "Oh, I can," she replied, her voice low but loaded with cruel confidence. She took a step toward him, closing the space, completely ignoring Mrs. Nancy a few feet away. "Since she's going to die, someone needs to take care of you." The phrase hit him with physical violence. "She's going to die." Marina didn't say if she dies or I hope she's okay. She uttered the sentence with the certainty of someone reading a pre-written script, a desired outcome. In that moment, Edward saw Marina's true nature, devoid of any filter. There was no passion there, just predatory ambition and a total lack of empathy. He tasted bitterness in his mouth, a repulsion rising from the pit of his stomach. He stepped back, as if her touch could burn him. Mrs. Nancy, who had been watching the scene frozen, stood and walked toward them, her face a mask of contempt. "Get out of here," she said to Marina, her voice trembling with contained fury. "Have the bare minimum of decency. My daughter's fighting for her life." Marina just shot a disdainful look at the older woman before turning her attention back to Edward. Completely ignoring his mother-in-law, she approached again, her hand touching his arm. The touch was cold. "Don't listen to her, Ed." "She's hysterical," she whispered, as if sharing a secret. "This is all for the best. It's fate giving us a chance. Think about it. No drama, no messy divorce, no alimony, just us. A fresh start." While the medical team fought to stabilize Sarah's pressure to perform an emergency C-section that would save 2 lives, Marina wove her plan in the hallway. Each passing second, each beep from the monitors leaking through the closed door was, for her, one step closer to victory. She squeezed his arm, her eyes fixed on his, trying to hypnotize him, pull him into her version of reality. "Now you're mine, Edward. All mine." The hallway fell silent for an instant. Her words hung in the sterile air, a declaration of possession made over another woman's potential tragedy. Edward was paralyzed, trapped between the repulsion he felt and the magnetic force of her will. He wanted to scream, send her away, but the words wouldn't come. His mind was in the operating room with Sarah. It was then that the operating room door opened. The sound made the 3 turn abruptly. Dr. Elena Ramirez emerged, her face tired but firm. She removed her surgical mask, revealing pressure marks on her skin. Her gaze passed over Mrs. Nancy, then Edward, and finally landed on Marina, who still held his arm, the smug smile lingering on her lips. There was a fraction of a second where the doctor seemed to assess the scene, the made-up woman in black and the pale husband. Edward stepped forward, his heart in his throat. "Doctor, Sarah, she..." Dr. Ramirez didn't look at him. Her eyes remained fixed on Marina, as if addressing the source of the tension in that hallway directly. With a clear, clinical voice devoid of any emotion but professionalism, she said, "The mother is in critical condition. We had to induce a coma to control the pressure and prevent further damage, but we saved the babies." There was a pause, a collective sigh of relief and fear. Babies. Plural. Edward frowned, confused. Babies? What do you mean? Dr. Ramirez finally shifted her gaze from Marina and faced him. "Yes, Mr. Thompson. Babies, they're triplets. 2 girls and a boy, a surprise for all of us. They're premature and heading to the NICU, but they're stable." The hallway went mute. The sound seemed sucked from the environment. Triplets. The word echoed, ricocheted off the white walls, deconstructing everything. Edward felt the ground vanish. 3. Not 1. 3. He looked at Mrs. Nancy, who had her hands over her mouth, eyes wide in a mix of shock and awe. But the true impact of the news was visible on Marina's face. The color drained from her cheeks. The venomous smile dissolved, replaced by a mask of pale incredulity. The "now you're mine" she'd whispered seconds before became a grotesque echo, a nightmare materializing before her eyes. Her plans, so carefully laid, didn't involve 1 baby, and certainly not 3. 3 children, 3 heirs to the Thompson empire, 3 indestructible living bonds to the woman she wanted to erase from existence, 3 permanent reminders of Edward's betrayal, 3 reasons for him never, ever, to be completely hers. The victory she'd deemed certain had turned into a crushing defeat, announced by a doctor's calm voice in a hospital hallway. The future she'd promised Edward was no longer a blank canvas for them to paint. It was now filled with 3 cribs, 3 cries, 3 lives that excluded her forever. The revelation of the triplets broke Marina's spell over Edward. The shock of the news, followed by the image of Sarah in an induced coma, a state suspended between life and death, yanked him from the fog of self-deception he'd lived in. Reality hit him with the force of a physical impact, leaving him breathless. He was no longer the protagonist of a forbidden romantic drama. He was a man whose wife was fighting for her life, while 3 fragile newborns depended entirely on him. Marina's presence in the hospital hallway, once a source of illicit comfort, became grotesque. Her selfish planning, her cruel words, all seemed absurdly small and sordid in the face of what was happening. He sent her away from the hospital with a harshness he'd never used before, a dry command that left no room for argument. For the first time, she obeyed without retort, her face pale with shock, defeat evident in her eyes. The following days were a blur of hospital corridors, whispered conversations with doctors, and the constant frightening sound of NICU monitors. Edward split between 2 floors, the intensive care unit where Sarah lay motionless, her body connected to a web of tubes and wires, and the neonatal ICU where Lily, Lucas, and Laura, his children, lived inside acrylic incubators. They were tiny human beings, unbelievably fragile, with nearly translucent skin and perpetually closed eyes. Looking at them was an overwhelming mix of love, fear, and a guilt so deep it seemed to have physical weight. They were the miracle he and Sarah had prayed for, but they'd arrived amid the greatest crisis of their lives, a crisis caused by him. Devastated and completely lost, Edward made his next mistake. On a night of extreme exhaustion, after spending hours by Sarah's bedside and then watching the babies through the glass, he returned to the empty, silent home. The silence was deafening, an echo of Sarah's absence and the life that should be there. In a moment of abject weakness, he called Marina. He didn't call out of desire or passion, but from a terrifying fear of loneliness. He convinced himself he needed someone, anyone, to fill the void, to have a human presence by his side as his world collapsed. He believed the lie that he needed someone around. Marina, seeing the opportunity to reinsert herself into the story, to regain lost control, accepted immediately. She arrived at his apartment not as the victorious mistress, but with a facade of sympathetic caregiver. She hugged him, made tea, listened to him talk about the doctors and the babies with a rehearsed expression of compassion. And so, she settled in. Edward, blinded by exhaustion and despair, allowed it. He told himself it was a temporary arrangement, an emergency measure until Sarah woke up. When the triplets finally got discharged, the home dynamic changed drastically. The modern glass and stone structure, once a sanctuary of silence, was invaded by a cacophony of life. Cries in stereo, the comings and goings of hastily hired nannies, the smell of milk and diapers. Edward dove headfirst into forced fatherhood, learning to change diapers, prepare bottles, decipher different cries. He was exhausted, but each moment with the children was a form of penance, a small act of reparation. Marina, on the other hand, watched everything with cold detachment. The reality of caring for 3 babies had none of the glamour she'd imagined for her life with Edward. She showed growing impatience with the constant interruptions. A baby's cry made her wince in irritation. The sour smell of regurgitated milk disgusted her. She refused to hold them, treating them as small, noisy obstacles disrupting her plans. In front of the nannies, she maintained distant politeness, but her gaze was pure boredom and contempt. Edward, however, refused to see. He was so immersed in his own pain and guilt that he interpreted Marina's attitude as stress, a natural adaptation difficulty. "She's just nervous," he told himself when he saw her roll her eyes at a cry starting. It's a lot of pressure for her too. He needed to believe she was his ally, because admitting otherwise meant confronting the fact that he'd invited a monster into his home, near his vulnerable children. The illusion was shattered by one of the nannies, an experienced woman named Lucia, who watched the situation with growing concern. One afternoon, as Edward arrived from the hospital, Lucia pulled him aside, her voice low and urgent. "Mr. Edward, I need to tell you something. Today, while you were out, Miss Marina," she yelled at the babies. They wouldn't stop crying and she lost her patience. "I saw her squeeze little Lily's arm hard, her tiny hand turned red." The accusation hit Edward like a punch to the gut. His first reaction was denial. "That's impossible, Lucia. Marina would never do that. It must be a misunderstanding." He wouldn't believe it. Hurt one of his children? Unthinkable. But the nanny's firm, honest gaze didn't waver. She wasn't gossiping. She was giving a warning. The seed of doubt, once planted, began to sprout. Edward dismissed Lucia, but her words echoed in his mind. He started observing Marina with different eyes, noticing the small gestures of repulsion he'd ignored before, the way she pulled away when he picked up one of the babies, the sigh of irritation when Lucas's cry woke her at night. The doubt turned into a sickening suspicion. He needed to know the truth. Without telling anyone, he contacted a security company and had a hidden camera installed in the living room, positioned to cover the area where the cribs were during the day. A few days later, he sat in his office, heart pounding against his ribs, and opened the monitoring app on his laptop. He watched the day's recordings, feeling like a voyeur in his own home. At first, nothing unusual. The nannies caring for the children, Marina coming and going, on her phone. Then, in a moment when the nannies were busy in the kitchen, all 3 babies started crying at once. Marina entered the room, her face a mask of fury. Edward watched, horrified, as she approached the cribs. She didn't pick them up, didn't soothe them. She stood, staring at them with pure hatred. "Stop it! Stop screaming!" she hissed. Then she leaned over Laura's crib and said, in a mocking, cruel voice, "You think anyone cares? Your mummy's sleeping forever, and your daddy. Ah, he's mine." Edward felt the air sucked from his lungs, but the worst was yet to come. Marina stepped back, sat on the couch and picked up a magazine, deliberately ignoring the desperate cries filling the room. She rolled her eyes, huffed, and then, speaking to herself but loud enough for the camera to catch, she said, "Damn the hour they were born. If it was just 1, I could handle it. But 3, if they were hers, it'd be poetic, the martyr leaving her legacy. But they're left for me, 3 little monsters to ruin everything." The disgust that overtook Edward was a physical, violent wave. He shut the laptop, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The image of her mocking his children, her voice calling them monsters. Everything clicked. The scratch on his neck, the earring in the car, the humiliation at the party, the coldness at the hospital. He didn't see a stressed woman. He saw a monster. That night, when Marina arrived from a meetup with friends complaining about traffic, he waited for her in the living room. He didn't yell. His voice was low, icy, devoid of any emotion. "I saw, Marina. I saw what you do when you think no one's watching." She froze, the smile vanishing from her face. "What are you talking about? I saw you with my children. I heard what you said." He approached her, and for the first time, Marina felt fear of him. His gaze was that of a stranger. "You're a monster." She tried to defend herself using her usual tactic, manipulation. "Me? I just said what you thought first. Don't pretend you wanted these kids. They ruined our plans." Her confession, the attempt to make him complicit in her cruelty, was the final nail in the coffin. "There are no our plans," he said, his voice cutting. "Grab your things and get out of my house now." "You can't do this, Edward. You need me." "The only thing I need," he replied, opening the front door, "is for you to disappear from my life and never come near my children again." He looked at her with such absolute contempt that she recoiled. "Get out, and this time it's forever." After the door closed behind Marina, a deep, heavy silence filled the house. It wasn't the empty silence of before, but a purifying silence, the calm after expelling a poison. Edward stood in the middle of the room, the echo of her last words still in the air. For the first time in months he was truly alone, not just physically, but alone with the totality of his choices, with the ruins he'd built himself. The relief of having expelled her was immediately replaced by the crushing weight of his new reality. There was nowhere left to run, no one else to blame or lean on. It was just him and 3 tiny, fragile lives depending on him for absolutely everything. That night, Lucas's cry woke him. Edward got up, his body aching from an exhaustion that seemed settled in his bones, and went to the crib. As he picked up his son, feeling the small body nestle against his chest, something changed. The panic gave way to a fierce, absolute protective instinct. Looking at that little face twisted in cry, he saw a reflection of Sarah, a trace of himself. He saw an innocent life that hadn't asked to be born amid such chaos. In that moment, fatherhood stopped being an obligation or penance. It became his sole mission, his only path to redemption. Edward's life turned into a relentless, sacred cycle of bottles, diapers, and sleepless nights. He let one nanny go, wanting to take on as much responsibility as possible. The nights were the hardest. To ensure he'd hear the slightest sign of discomfort, he dragged his mattress to the living room, creating an improvised nest on the floor, surrounded by the 3 cribs. Often exhaustion won, and he fell asleep right there, with one baby sleeping on his chest, another nestled in the curve of his arm, and the third softly snoring in the crib beside. The house, once a monument to design and architecture, became a functional sanctuary for survival, with toys scattered, bottles sterilizing on the stove, and the scent of infancy permeating every room. But guilt was a constant shadow accompanying him. It was present in the silence between cries, in his tired face's reflection in the bathroom mirror, and most intensely in the hospital corridors. Every day, without fail, he visited Sarah. The routine was unchanging. He sat in the armchair by her bed, held her hand, a hand that seemed cold and lifeless, and talked. He told her about the day, about the children. He said Lily had her eyes, Lucas was stubborn like him, and Laura had a smile that appeared even in sleep. And then, when the day's narrative ran out, he begged forgiveness. The words came in a hoarse whisper, laden with suffocating regret. "Forgive me, Sarah. Forgive me for what I did to us, to our story. I was weak, an idiot, selfish. I traded gold for trash. I don't deserve you, never did." Tears came uncontrollably, silent, streaming down his face as he confessed every mistake, every lie, every moment of weakness. He read to her, the same art books she loved, hoping his voice could pierce the coma's veil and reach her. "I just want a miracle," he repeated, the phrase becoming a mantra, a desperate prayer. "Just one more chance. I swear I'd do everything different." The months dragged on. The babies grew, gained weight, their little faces acquiring distinct personalities. Lily's first smile, Lucas's first babble, the way Laura followed him with her eyes. Each small victory was a source of immense joy, but also acute pain, for they were moments he should be sharing with Sarah. He took photos, recorded videos, accumulating a file of memories to show her if and when she returned. Until, on an autumn morning, 6 months after the birth, the miracle happened. It came without fanfare, without a dramatic event. Edward was dozing in the armchair by her bed, head lolling to the side, exhausted after a particularly rough night with the triplets. The soft morning light filtered through the hospital room window, creating a peaceful atmosphere. That's when he felt it. A nearly imperceptible movement, a light pressure on his hand. Sarah's fingers moved. He opened his eyes instantly, heart racing. He looked at her hand intertwined with his and saw a small tremor, a spasm, then a weak but unmistakable squeeze. He held his breath, not daring to move. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to her face and found her eyes open. No longer empty and distant, they watched him, weak, pale, but unequivocally alive and present. "You came back," he whispered, his voice choked, breaking into a sob. The tears he'd shed for months of guilt turned into tears of overwhelming relief that made him bend over her hand, crying openly. Her voice, when it came, was a thread, weak from disuse, but clear. "I heard everything, Edward." He raised his head, face wet, confused. "Heard what?" "Everything," she repeated, her eyes fixed on his, without anger, without pity, just with exhausted clarity. "The stories about the children, and the others. The parts where you begged forgiveness." Those words hit him harder than any accusation. She'd been there all along, a conscious prisoner in her own body, hearing every confession, every desperate promise. Shame consumed him. He slipped from the armchair and knelt by the bed, the gesture not dramatic but a collapse of his own legs. He rested his forehead on the mattress, unable to face her. "Let me fix everything," he pleaded, his voice muffled by sobs. "I'll change, I promise. I'll do anything. Give me a chance to show you." There was a long silence. He waited for the verdict, for the anger, for the rejection he so deserved. But when Sarah spoke again, her voice carried none of that. She just said, "Look at me, Edward." He raised his face. Sarah's eyes shifted from him for a moment, focusing on a point across the room. He followed her gaze and saw the 3 small photos he'd taped to the wall, facing her bed, the faces of Lily, Lucas, and Laura. "So start with them," she said, her voice gaining new firmness. "Start with our children. Be the father they deserve. And if one day I can forgive, it'll be for them, not for you." Those words weren't the forgiveness he craved, but they were something more valuable. A path, a direction, a chance, not to erase the past, but to build a future worth it. Sarah's recovery was slow and arduous. Months of physical therapy to relearn walking, therapy to regain strength. Edward was by her side every step, not as a husband seeking absolution, but as a silent, dedicated partner. He took her to appointments, cared for the children so she could rest, and at night when she woke from nightmares, he was there, not to offer empty words, but just to fetch a glass of water, to be a calm presence in the dark. He learned to love differently, not with the selfish passion of before, but with a love of service, patient and unwavering. He was learning to be a father, and in the process, slowly relearning to be a man worthy of her love. The day Sarah returned home was a rebirth. The house which she'd left as a pregnant, betrayed wife now welcomed her as a survivor and mother of 3. Seeing her on the couch, a baby in each arm and the third crawling at her feet, was the image Edward would keep forever. Gradually, the dynamic between them began to change. The tense silence gave way to conversations about the children. Conversations turned to shared laughter when Lucas tried to stuff a piece of broccoli up his nose. Sarah started observing Edward, seeing the father he'd become. She saw the patience with which he soothed Laura at night, the genuine joy on his face when Lily said "Dada" for the first time. She saw a man no longer running, but deeply, undeniably present. Forgiveness didn't come in a single cathartic moment. It seeped in gradually, in the small routines of daily life, in trust rebuilt not with words, but consistent actions. A year after Sarah woke on a sunny afternoon in the backyard, the triplets, wobbling and supporting each other, took their first steps together. a small, unsteady troop laughing and falling on the grass. Edward and Sarah watched, side by side, and then Sarah turned to him, and on her face was a smile. Not a polite or forced smile, but a genuine one, reaching her eyes and lighting up her whole being. In that instant, Edward understood. The miracle wasn't Sarah surviving the coma. The miracle wasn't him getting a second chance. The true miracle was that smile. It was the ability to love again after everything had been broken. What did you think of this story? On a scale of 0 to 10, what score would you give it? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to get all our stories. And take the chance to watch another surprising story by clicking on the screen. Thanks and see you next time.